Can you hear me? The mic is on. Wonderful. Thank you very much for coming here today. I'm delighted to be in Denmark once again. I thank Wafad and Cressida DeWitt for organizing this important event. Today I focus on marijuana, but in good conscience, I cannot dismiss changing drug views, policies, and laws that are the current root of why we are changing our views on marijuana, at least some of us. Most pundits agree on the need to treat drug addiction, that addiction can be viewed as a public health issue, and people in need of treatment should be treated without any concerns of prison involvement. But drug policy views are entering a new stage, a dispute between those that advocate unrestricted drug use and others supporting restricted use and access. At one end of the spectrum, some in the harm reductionist community advocate for destigmatizing not only people in need of treatment, but destigmatizing all drug use. They advocate for legalizing all drugs. And once you legalize, you commercialize. They advocate for reform of criminal justice, in some cases justified, but in the cases when you reform criminal justice to allow people to sell poisons such as fentanyl, you've crossed a line that I cannot cross with you. They actually advocate for drug use as a benefit to many individuals, a source of comfort, pleasure, and self-medication. I remember just recently Ethan Nadelman, who was one of the pioneers in drug policy reform. He recently asked Dr. Nora Volkow, the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, why don't you do research on drugs as serving benefits? Why are you only promoting research on drugs as harmful? Of course, that's not the mandate of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, because so many of the cases of benefits are self-evident. They advocate for removing legal restrictions on drugs as unrealistic and doomed to failure. They reject restrictive drug policies, and they even blame the drug war for addiction. They blame addiction on the drug war. They blame the drug war for the opioid overdose crisis in the United States. They attribute drug use to social determinants of health. The root causes of drug use are failed drug policies. They are due to family problems, due to stress, anxiety, trauma, homelessness, and social injustices. This may be true in individuals, but they fail to recognize that many people that suffer hardships, that suffer poverty, that suffer discrimination, that suffer abuse as children, do not resort to drugs. Many people exercise a measure of self-control. They exercise a measure of discipline and personal responsibility and do not resort to drugs as a reason, as a rationale, using their personal lives as a rationale for it. This movement is skeptical, dismissive, or even in denial of scientific evidence showing that drug use is a root cause of many adverse consequences to the individual, to families, to psychological, behavioral, mental, or social distress. They believe it is irrational to prevent distribution of clean drugs to drug users, or irrational to imprison people who distribute drugs that many can be viewed as poisons, fentanyl being the supreme example currently. They refuse to acknowledge that easy access to drugs, that normalization and destigmatization of use are among the current causes of the drug crisis. They feign praise, that means they fake praise for prevention, or acknowledge prevention with faint praise. It is very worrisome that their voices are growing more aggressive and intrusive in the halls of policymakers. It is very worrisome that these activists have recruited the very professionals who in the past objectively documented the harms associated with drug use. Physicians, scientists, academics are now joining the chorus. These are the very professionals that traditionally were intolerant of drug use because they recognized the severe consequences in individuals. More worrisome is that the scientific evidence that many have accumulated over the past 30 or 40 years is now beginning to reside in shadows in the background during these debates, or it is being distorted to advance a culture of legalization. Those with conservative views on drug policy perceive drug use addiction, at least use, as a discretionary, voluntary activity with potentially severe burdens on individuals, on families, on nations, on cultures. They support the involvement of the criminal justice system to curtail supply. What is the reality now? Over the last 20 years in the United States, the country underwent a vast change in perception of drugs, resulting in changes in policies and drug laws. These changes reversed decades of progress. Among some of the changes that I was firsthand to observe, because I served on the President's Opioid Commission recently, was how we got into the opioid crisis. We got into the opioid crisis and we were an outlier. We were different than Europe. We were different than Australia. We were different than Africa or South America. We were different than almost every other country in the world because the physicians were led to believe, first by the pharmaceutical industry and then by a very vocal and aggressive patient movement, that pain patients are victims of the war on drugs and that opioids are safe for people experiencing pain. Nothing could be further than the scientific truth. But science was subsumed with vast campaigns that spent millions of dollars educating physicians, educating patients that opioids can be safe. We had a 400% increase in opioid prescribing, which led to the use, misuse, and addiction amongst millions of people. And then the conversion to heroin, and then now the third wave, the conversion to fentanyl, and the fourth wave, the combination of fentanyl plus other drugs. What were these changes? There was a tenacious movement to legalize any and all forms and all doses of marijuana as a medicine. Without the scientific evidence that underpins any medicine, which is dose response curve, formulation, purity, evidence for a specific disease as opposed to a global use of the drug for multiple diseases, Parkinson's, Crohn's, Alzheimer's, you name it, without any scientific evidence that would achieve the bar of approval by our Food and Drug Administration. There was unrestricted prescribing of opioids for any forms of pain under a broad range of medical circumstances. And there was criminal justice reform at multiple levels of government, which translates into emboldening drug distribution. The consequences of these changes are evident. Since 1999, 841,000 people have died from a drug overdose in the US. That's equal to 14% of the entire population of Denmark or Norway, or 8% of Sweden's population. In 2020, the death rate due to drug overdoses in the US is 95,000 people. Many deaths are homeless people or among people living alone in hotel rooms or other units provided by city governments as harm reduction measures. Dealers in open-air fentanyl markets are not arrested by police who witness deals. Yet this movement claims that society has not been liberal enough. If only a user could buy pure drugs at fixed doses, addiction and overdose deaths would disappear. This is a quote. But you know, the opioid crisis, during the prescription opioid crisis phase, people were given pure drugs at fixed doses, and yet they misused them, and yet they died like flies. By 2006, we had over 7,000 deaths. Arresting drug dealers evokes derision and designation as a drug warrior, a fossil of the past, a pearl clutcher. I'm not wearing pearls, but I've been accused of being a pearl clutcher, which implies a fuddy-duddy woman who touches her pearls when she's nervous, because what she's saying is not correct. Some people have good intentions. Political ideology and personal emotions or drug experiences are factors in this movement. Some believe they are the voice of ethics or the future. They are the voice of caring, of fairness, and of free will to do whatever you want with your own body. Others have conflicts of interest, deeply rooted in personal or financial incentives. And we're pretty much aware what those conflicts of interest are. There are people who trace political donations and find the sources of them. There are people such as myself who've traced where the pharmaceutical industry gave donations to medical associations, to regulatory boards, in order to advance opioid prescribing. There are consulting fees that are conflict of interest, drug marketing, donations from billionaire activists or from drug distributors, or reimbursements as providers of addiction, housing, and other services. This is especially true on the West Coast of the United States, in San Francisco, where there's a huge industry now in providing addiction services and providing housing. These advocates are not held accountable for the consequences of enabling a drug culture. They are not held accountable for this social experiment that already has a failure record. They are not held accountable for this human experiment without real consent by the individuals who are using drugs. They dismiss the alternative view to reject drug use to reject addiction as a lifestyle choice, and to impede the drug supply. These views are also rooted in ethics. In value of health, of security, of safety, of personal responsibility. They are rooted in the value of the potential of each human brain and each human life, as I do. With legalization and normalization, use will rise. It's inevitable, especially among young people. What course will Scandinavian Nordic countries take? Will they engage in a vast human experiment with a pipeline of hundreds of psychoactive substances waiting in chemistry labs to be marketed without informed consent? Because it's very difficult to draw the line. Today, it's a marijuana plant with 3% THC. Tomorrow, it's 90% THC and no longer a plant. Today, it's heroin and fentanyl, or psilocybin or LSD. Tomorrow, it's an array of thousands of hallucinogens, stimulants, opioids that live in the patent literature, that live in the biomedical literature, ready to spring loose on a population without constraint. What will nations choose? Will we return to judicious regulations and laws designed to protect the brains and minds of humans? What will we do? One tiny promising episode happened in my life recently. I was on a panel in 2019 before President Biden declared his candidacy for the presidency. And the panel consisted of him, myself, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, former Governor Jeb Bush, and I was asked by the audience what I thought of marijuana. And I voiced my concerns about marijuana as being a solution to the opioid crisis, because that was the question. And I said, the evidence actually is contrary to what the talking points are. The evidence is that, in fact, people who use marijuana are more likely to develop an opioid use disorder and more likely to fail treatment for opioids. And Joe Biden stood up and clapped. And he was vilified in the press for clapping when I said that. But at least he clapped. And now on to marijuana. So I'm going to stand here so I can actually see my own slides. This is my only relationship of conflict of interest. Oh boy, these are not advancing the way they should. There's no animation here. Do you have any idea why? In any case, Steve Pinker wrote a book called Enlightenment Now. He's a professor at Harvard. And he gave me this slide showing that since 1900, our society has managed to reduce all evidence of, not all, but most evidence of accidental deaths. We've managed to curtail them, including deaths by fires, deaths by falls, deaths by drownings, deaths by poison gases. The only one we haven't managed is deaths from drugs. So what are the challenges of our current drug policy? It's do not stigmatize drug use. Remember this phrase. There is a movement to destigmatize all drug use, not just to destigmatize people who have an addiction and need treatment. There's a movement to normalize use, to legalize all drugs and accept use What will we talk about today? All the animation is gone. Do you have any idea why? Was this converted to PDF? Because it shouldn't be. It should be a PowerPoint presentation, because this looks more like a PDF. So we're going to talk quickly. It's very difficult to do this presentation unless it's in the proper format. The biology, adolescence, marijuana potency, and the role of parents. I'll wait a moment, thank you. Are there any questions in the meanwhile, just while we're waiting? Because without animation, so much is lost. Yes?
I just have a question about, I guess what I've noticed is that, like, there are, as you say, billionaire philanthropists, funding quite a lot of research at the moment, and, like, I wonder, do any of these, people have financial conflicts of interest in terms of investing?
Do I have financial?
No, in terms of, like, it's not always clear, if a pharmaceutical company, if a pharmaceutical company sponsors a trial, it's usually evident that they're sponsoring a trial and that they make the specific drug, etc. Whereas if a lot of foundations are perhaps funded by a very rich person are sponsoring a trial, we don't actually know if those foundations have links to the cannabis industry. So
it's an excellent question. Unfortunately, and there's a lot of discussion about this, foundations don't necessarily have to disclose anything. Charities don't have to disclose. When pharmaceutical company sponsors a clinical trial, the very powerful FDA, which I am a very strong advocate for, they have very rigorous ways of checking the evidence, the veracity, the truthfulness of the data and the statistics. They have thousands of people who include statisticians, chemists, pharmacologists who can really do an excellent job. So a clinical trial generally, if it undergoes FDA scrutiny, is going to be a fairly responsible trial. The problem is not so much the drug approval process as it is the process by which medical associations and others receive sponsorship from pharmaceutical industries. A pain patient movement that got money, the Federation of State Medical Boards, the Joint Commission on accreditation of healthcare organizations. There were many organizations that received a lot of donations from the industry, and they were unrestricted grants. They were not donations that said, this is what you must do. But they said, here's an amount of money, and if things look good, maybe next year we'll give you some more. And you don't have to define if this looks good. Yes, we're all set? Okay, there we go. Wonderful. Oh, it's still not animating. Fires, drownings, poison gas. Now we're talking, and drugs. Thank you. So what we're seeing now are the crises that we have, which are opioids, marijuana, cocaine and meth, which has had a recurrence, especially combined with fentanyl. New psychoactive substances, as I refer to them, we have an unlimited supply. There are over 1,200 fentanyl analogs possible that are in the patent literature and in the medicinal chemistry literature. Hallucinogens, thousands. Analogs of cocaine, my own lab and my chemist collaborator made 600 of them. Most of them very potent. It's all there. And if someone draws the line and says, You can legalize marijuana, but you can't legalize Delta 8 marijuana, only Delta 9 THC. How do you go into court and start to fight this? Every one of those thousands of drugs can become a battle. And then we have hallucinogens, which is the next phase in the United States with certainty. We are soon going to have, and we already have, a vast movement to medicalize hallucinogens for the treatment of depression and other psychological problems like end-stage cancer. Soon we will see that one or more of them is going to be approved, and with that will follow the legalization movement as happened with marijuana. And the end result is all drugs normal and legal. So these are the challenges. Accept use, just reduce the harm. We saw that with the opioids. We accepted use for all forms of pain, unrestricted prescriptions, and what happened? More than 4 million people with an addiction to opioids, 12 million people misusing them, and now thousands are dying. So let's take a look at these 4 topics. Past year marijuana use, since this movement began, it began in actually 1979. There's a video showing a group of men sitting around and saying, the best way to legalize marijuana is to medicalize it first. Once you put in the minds of people that this is legitimate medicine, we'll be able to get the legalization through. And since then, we've seen this vast increase in number of users. The rise is primarily in adults of child-rearing and childbearing ages, people 18 to 34, and that's one of the worst possible age groups to increase use because they have influence on the next generation. The prevalence of marijuana use disorder amongst 15 to 19-year-olds. The highest prevalence, not surprisingly, is the United States. New Zealand is also there, surprisingly, and Spain, but Canada's coming very quickly behind. Parts of Europe, parts of South America. There's a huge increase in the number of young people with cannabis use disorder. So what does marijuana do to the brain? How does it act? And why are we so concerned about its effects in young people? The most important concept to think about in terms of biology is that marijuana resembles cannabinoids that the brain makes. If you look here, LSD, which is a compound that's not found in the brain, resembles serotonin. So LSD acts in the parts of the brain where this chemical message serotonin is found. In the same way that anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol are made in the brain, they are cannabinoids because the brain has a very extensive cannabinoid system, and so does the body. And THC resembles the structure of the endocannabinoids, and it acts to some extent in the same signaling system of the brain that our own brain cannabinoids worked. Now, the talking point of the marijuana industry is, well, we have cannabinoids. Marijuana is just simply another one of them. After all, it's a natural product that acts on a natural system in the brain. Where does it act? It acts in places that are involved in judgment, impulse control. It acts in places that are involved in motor coordination, activity, reward. And how does it act? Well, Every single nerve cell in our brain, of which we have 80 million, communicates to some extent by sending a chemical message from one cell to the next. And these chemical messages are the key to understanding how marijuana works. What is the method? What is the whole concept behind it? When you and I communicate, there's a transmitter. I'm speaking to you. My words are the chemical message in a sense. And there's a receiver that picks up the message. In every nerve cell in the body, in the brain, we have exactly that same system. We have a nerve sending that sends a chemical message. The chemical message is released, and it goes to a target in the other side and sends a signal. And that's how we are able to do the myriad functions of the brain. Marijuana comes in not in discrete amounts, not in a special tiny bits of concentration that are tightly regulated like the brain does, but it floods the system. It floods the parts of the brain that it picks up that are the cannabinoid signaling system, and it displaces our own cannabinoids. But the difference is that the signals it triggers are longer, they're louder, and they're different than what our own chemical messages do. So the cannabinoid system in the brain is critical for a number of functions. It helps to guide the circuitry, the circuit diagram of the brain. It helps to form connections between cells throughout brain development and even in adulthood. This is how complicated. This is just a picture of the different types of cells and different types of connections that have to be made, and that the cannabinoid system is involved in forming that circuit, those circuits. So what are the risks of marijuana to the adolescent? In the developing adolescent brain, the brain undergoes many changes. Not only changes in structure, not only changes in circuitry, but also changes in function. It increases the amount of gray and white matter in different parts of the brain. It prunes connections that are not needed. It strengthens some connections. It prunes them, as you can see. There's little guys in your brain that are actually cutting the branches. No, there aren't. It's just a symbol of it's a critical part of adolescent brain development. It also increases the amount of fat matter around nerve cells, the wires that connect one cell to another. They're insulating, and in the developing brain, the insulation, the fat increases enormously to make the signals much more efficient and much quicker. And all of these things are happening in the adolescent brain. And Yasmin Hurd, who's done a wonderful job of summarizing, and I won't go through all this in great detail, she has shown all the ways in which THC and marijuana can influence brain development at the level of the fetus, during infancy, during childhood, during adolescence. And those of you who are biologists, I urge you to read her summary and what are some of the possible consequences. There are so many at different stages of brain development. Adolescent marijuana users are more likely to use other substances. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to binge on alcohol. They're more likely to engage in heavy alcohol drinking. And they're more likely to engage in other illicit drug use. Bob DuPont, who will be addressing you later, is one of the drivers of this paper. I co-authored it with him. Adolescents are much more vulnerable to marijuana use disorder, to addiction to marijuana in its various levels of severity. If a child uses marijuana the first year heavily, 10% of those children between 12 and 17 will have a cannabis use disorder. If they continue to use until they are 4 years later, 20% will have a cannabis use disorder. It's different for the adult. The adult of 18 to 25, it starts off at about 5%, and it ends close to 11%. So there's a huge difference in the severity and in the vulnerability of the adolescent brain to become addicted. And part of that is because the brain is undergoing such rapid development, and the cannabinoid system is so critical in this development. We know without much doubt that marijuana can interfere with education, because under the influence of marijuana, it is very difficult to concentrate. It is difficult to learn under the influence, so that marijuana use is associated with educational achievement. In high school, grades are lower, more likely to drop out, less likely to enter college, and in college, there is an effect, again, in terms of dropping out, as well as in lower grades, and frequent users are less likely to even continue in college and more likely to drop out. Again, we have to worry about cause and effect. Are people attracted to marijuana more likely to have problems in university or high school? Or is it that marijuana itself creates the problems? And that dissecting those two and trying to attribute one to the other is always a challenge. What about marijuana and psychosis, or marijuana and mental health? What is the evidence for psychosis and schizophrenia, marijuana, and what about correlation and causation, which is such a huge and controversial topic in the field? We know in terms of mental health that marijuana use in adolescence is associated with increased risk of depression and suicidal behavior later in life. These are suicides. These are in Colorado. The percent that are positive for marijuana has increased dramatically over the past decade. And the risks for mental health problems, the odds ratios, non-users are always 1. The risk for depression, for suicide, and suicide thoughts and completions is much higher in adolescents who use marijuana. What about psychosis and schizophrenia? What is psychosis? What is schizophrenia? People use those terms. They say marijuana is a real problem, and yet people who have not experienced it, who have not seen it close up in families, who have not studied it in the textbook, don't really know what that means. It means suspiciousness and paranoia. It means worrying about whether or not people are looking in and listening to you. It means worrying about whether or not you're being recorded. It means being very, very concerned about things that are not real, that interfere with normal life. It means having bizarre thoughts, delusions about the world. It means having fragmented thoughts, disordered thoughts and ideas. And it means hallucinations of hearing and feeling and smelling and seeing. And these hallucinations are primarily hearing, but they can be smells and other forms of senses as well. Now, psychosis has all these elements, or one of these 4, but it could be temporary, it could be caused by multiple factors. Schizophrenia is these symptoms, not all in the same person, sometimes a few, sometimes one, but schizophrenia is these symptoms that persist and can only be treated in some people, some fortunate people with antipsychotic drugs. And in some people, it's a chronic lifetime disease that cuts lifespan, that interferes with everything in life, including education, employment, and so on. So people say, well, it's all political. Whenever you see psychosis, you attribute it to marijuana, but marijuana is not a cause, it's not involved. And then you look in the 1890s in India of a report that was published between 1873, 1893. They were looking, at that time it was politically correct to call them insane asylums. Now we don't call them that anymore. But they looked at the number of people inside these Bengal insane asylums who were marijuana users as opposed to alcohol users, as opposed to opioid users. And they found that marijuana use was by far the most prevalent cofactor of having a mental disease affiliated with psychosis or generally attributable to psychosis. And so that was long before marijuana became political. There was evidence of this already. Now, in adolescents that use cannabis, there's an increased risk for psychosis in later life. There's an increased risk. The odds ratio is about 70% higher. You can predict that the onset of psychosis is earlier. The modifiers are age of cannabis use, the frequency of use, exposure to childhood trauma, and use of other substances and genetic factors. What is so interesting in 2021 now is that we are beginning to have enough data, not just to look at single studies, but to look at 10 studies, 15, 80 studies, and combine them all together and do what's called meta-analysis. Analyze all of them and see if there are patterns that we can summarize the association of marijuana with adverse outcomes. And this is an example of one of these, what's called meta-analysis, which means you take everything that's published in the literature and you extract out of it what are the salient features that attribute marijuana to other human problems. So this is an example, and you'll be seeing several examples of this. So then we get into the debate of correlation versus causation. And I'd like to just give you an insight into what that debate is and why it's so important. What is the difference? So we know that in May and June and July and August, there's more sunshine, there's more warmth, and then when fall comes in northern or even southern hemisphere countries, there's increasing cold and snow in some places, and the cycle continues. So during the summer months, people tend to eat watermelon more and drink lemonade more. And during the summer months, people tend to have more heart attacks because they are outdoors, they're doing a lot more vigorous activities than a more sedentary life in the winter months. But during the summer months, we also have more wars in history. We have more wars. And causation means that watermelon or lemonade or heart attacks cause wars. Or wars cause you to eat more watermelon. Carlton, you're laughing. Or to drink more lemonade, or wars. Well, I think wars do cause some people to have more heart attacks. So the question is, what is the association between things that happen at the same time or in tandem? So that's an absurd extrapolation. But in the biomedical literature, there are criteria for causation. How strong is the association? How strong is marijuana associated with psychosis? The larger the association, the better the data. How consistent is it across countries, across studies, across different hospitals or different universities? What about the timing? Does psychosis come before marijuana use? Does marijuana use come before psychosis? What about dose response? Do you have more psychotic people as the dose increases, or do you have less or the same? What about specificity? Is it definitely marijuana, or is it 10 other factors involved? What about biological plausibility? Is there a biological mechanism that could explain this causation? So what about the strength of the association? For non-organic psychotic disorders, that means not metabolic, liver disease, or some other things that are very obvious, the most robust risk factors, and this again was done with a huge, huge data set of analysis of thousands and thousands of people in hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts that were whittled down. The clinical high-risk state for psychosis, that's the biggest risk factor, and that means certain risk factors in, like genetics and so on, family history. The second biggest risk factor was cannabis use disorder. The risk was approximately 4. Childhood adversities was lower, and then there are many others that are lower. Different places, different countries have shown the association to be true. In terms of the United Kingdom, Germany, New Zealand, Israel, Sweden, the US, the Netherlands, and so on. So different countries using their own sets of population, their own demographics, and in some cases their own definitions, have all seen the same association. What about potency, and what about the timing? So if people go into an emergency department after using marijuana and having a psychotic reaction, they're frightened, they're terrified, their friends, their family bring them in because they're unusual. If they go in, what you find is that they will convert to full-blown schizophrenia. And the conversion rate is somewhere between 20 and 40% if they continue to use the drug. So clearly, marijuana use precedes the schizophrenia in these cases. So in terms of conversion, the highest risk is marijuana. Lower risk is the use of alcohol, and lower still risk is the use of other drugs. And the greatest risk is use amongst younger ages, 16 to 25. Marta DeForte did a spectacular job of looking at how frequently marijuana is used and the potency of it, means THC, in different cities, 11 different sites, and found that in London, in Amsterdam, and in Paris, the more frequent the drug use, the more potent the use, the higher the percent of people with schizophrenia. This was in 11 cities, but these are the data that I have featured. Biological plausibility. If you give a normal person, a subject in a lab, an intravenous dose of THC, they are going to show symptoms of psychosis. Not all, not full-blown, but some of those 4 qualities of psychosis. If you give them an antipsychotic drug, the psychosis diminishes greatly, the ones that are used frequently. So what can we conclude? Marijuana produces suspiciousness, paranoia, grandiose delusions, conceptual disorganization, all of these things. And these are the number of studies that have been done showing this. That's quite a shopping list that says in otherwise healthy people, THC of marijuana can produce these symptoms. So if you look at causality versus association, you begin to see that there is strength of association. There's some consistency across countries. There's a timing. There is a dose response. There's biological plausibility. And the users of other potent recreational drugs can develop a psychosis as well, but in terms of specificity, it's less so than marijuana. So in summary, the teen brain, we can summarize it. I use an acronym, BAD apps. Their brain changes, their addiction. There are deficits in cognition under the influence. There's amotivation syndrome, which can translate into not desiring to go to college or dropping out. But there's also amotivation in terms of employment. There's psychiatric diseases and safety issues, all within the adolescent. What about in adults? People say, well, okay, we're going to keep marijuana away from children, but adults are scot-free. Are they scot-free? Marijuana effects in adults with no pre-existing medical or psychiatric disorders. How strong is the evidence? The evidence on, again, this is a meta-analysis of many papers, so this is more powerful than a single report. The evidence that marijuana is associated with psychosis is the strongest of all in terms of adverse effects. Psychosocial functioning is also diminished, and that's very strong evidence. And then lesser evidence, we have motivation as adults. We have, of lesser evidence, poor executive function, working memory, and anxiety. Again, meta-analysis taking into account multiple papers. The adverse effects in adults of cannabis, these are from a French study that was done. Psychosis, neurological problems, dependence, of course, cardiac problems, gastrointestinal problems, cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which means vomiting. And what you see is that as people age, the proportion of adverse events increases with a function and with continuing cannabis use for all of these. So what about if a child initiates marijuana during adolescence? What happens when they turn 35? Madeline Meyer did a wonderful study in 2012. She published it in PNAS showing the adverse effects on IQ. You're very fortunate to have her here to give her some of her more recent data as well as this data. But there are other studies. Again, these are this is a longitudinal study. This is a single study. And what it showed is that by mid-30s, young adult and adolescent onset of regular marijuana use were more likely than low use or non-use to have used other drugs, to be high-risk alcohol drinker, to smoke daily, less likely to be in a relationship. And so these are clearly differences in what non-users, low-level users, compared to heavy users during childhood. The next and very important issue to think about is the potency of marijuana. Marijuana is no longer a natural plant, folks. Marijuana is now. The natural plant was 1 to 3% THC. It's now 14%, 90%. There are all sorts of preparations of it, and any effort to regulate them has been thwarted. Why does potency matter? What does potency mean? What are the public health consequences? Can we view it as a natural plant when the potency is so much greater than the plant that grows in the wild? Can we view marijuana as a natural plant when products such as gummy bears and shatter and dabs and vapes are routes of delivery? Can we view marijuana as a natural plant when vaping has become a problem? Let's take a look at what happened to potency over the years. It started at 1 to 3%, and as time went on from the 1990s onward, it's gone up to 90%. Greater high, more tolerance, more addiction, more profit. That's the story, and this is just the data showing the THC potency in marijuana and in resins. We don't have to perseverate on it. Why does potency matter? With alcohol, we know very well that a glass of beer is about 4 to 5%, that a glass of wine is about 12%, that spirits are anywhere from 40% or higher. And it's easy from all of you to intuit that the more potent the alcohol, the faster one can become intoxicated and lose one's sense of where and when and how and what and time. So potency has always been a goal of producers. With cocaine, crack cocaine is a different salt form than powder cocaine. It's a bicarbonate salt that when smoked, the salt falls off, you get free base, and you get a pure form of cocaine that rushes into the brain at top speed, so that the addictive potential of crack cocaine is higher at the same dose. With cocaine hydrochloride, if you try to heat it, that salt is so tight that what they call it the ionic bond between them, that you can't heat it unless you destroy the cocaine molecule. So crack cocaine is a very potent form of delivering the free base to the brain. The same that has been done with methamphetamine. In this case, it's the hydrochloride salt that is crystal meth that is highly addictive because it delivers much more to the brain more quickly. And that's what we're seeing now in the marijuana industry, the desire to deliver much more potent marijuana. These are the types of formulations of marijuana. I've never seen a drugstore carry this stuff in real medications, have you? But these are sold in dispensaries. The reality is that the sale of extracts are, in some places, with 70% THC, they're 20% of sales now. High potency is the preference of daily users because they've become tolerant, which means they're the biggest customers, which means the strategy worked. Because if you become tolerant too, you're going to look for higher potency and you're going to continue to use, and you start to use daily. Any effort in the US to cap the concentration of THC, to say no more than 10%, no more than 15%, has failed in every state legislature that I've been in. And so the whole idea is to produce as much potent marijuana as possible at lower price because the profits are higher and the gains in terms of addicting people is greater. This is a study from our lab. We have some really interesting data that I can't show you yet because it's not been reported. But this one has been published, showing that 24 hours after the last dose of marijuana, the amount in the brain is double what it is in blood. And at 24 hours, it hasn't cleared at all. It's very, very hefty. There's a lot of marijuana left in the brain. So what happens with high potency? What are the consequences? If there are no consequences, who cares? But there are consequences to young people in adolescence. They have much more regular use. They use other drugs. They're more likely to use tobacco. They're more likely to have an alcohol dependency, more likely to have other problems. These are consequences of high potency marijuana. What are the consequences of continued or high frequency marijuana use? Again, the highest, the most potent forms of marijuana, the consequences are greater in terms of continued use of marijuana. What are the consequences of edibles and vaporized marijuana? They're associated with more psychiatric symptoms in the adult. This is, again, a meta-analysis done with hundreds and hundreds of people with multiple papers that were used to try to make sense out of it. And this was medical marijuana in terms of potency and adult function. And it was found that as the amount of THC increased, it increased from 2.5 milligrams a day to 20 milligrams, which is a fraction of what the high potency marijuana is nowadays. Because 20 milligrams per day is peanuts compared to 70 to 300 milligrams that are used in some vaping methods and in dabs. And what they found is that the distorted thinking and perception increased in this analysis as a function of dose. Dizziness, lightheadedness increased as a function of dose, that on people, adults 50 and over, using it for medical purposes. So, high potency THC is associated with psychosis, anxiety, lower age of schizophrenia, impaired brain function, impaired driving, emergency care, use of other drugs and other effects, and more use with higher risk for addiction. And where are we going to have politicians willing to say, this is wrong, we have to cut the dose of marijuana? I'd like to just do two more quick topics. One is parents and children. This is a study we published very recently showing that if mothers and fathers never use marijuana, their children are much less likely to use. But if they used in the past, in their lifetime, but not in the past year, just lifetime, their children are much more likely to use. And if they used in the last year, if they use less than 52 days, which means less than once a week, their children are much more likely to use. And these children are either adolescents or 18 to 30-year-olds living at home with their parents. So what we're seeing is a stepwise, depending on what the parents use, the children are much likelier to use marijuana if their parents use. And we eliminated many confounding factors, socioeconomic status, neighborhoods, you name it, in order to get these data. These were very carefully crafted. I wonder if you can advance that manually. It's not seeming to work. Thank you. Miley Cyrus, when she was interviewed recently, said she quit using marijuana because her brain was no longer functioning. She felt that she had lost the edge of really exquisite thinking in terms of composing and performing. But her mother, who is a very heavy user, threatened her and said if she quits marijuana, she's not going to be her manager any longer. So in a recent interview, she said she had to start using again to keep her mother by her side, but she would not use except after hours now. The influence of parents on children. The ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain Development Study in the United States, which has recruited over 11,000 parents and children pairs, has found that fetuses exposed to marijuana in the uterus are much more likely to show symptoms of psychiatric proneness when they're 9 years old. In other words, they have psychosis proneness. They're not psychotic, but they have some symptoms. They are more likely. They're also more likely to, and this is, don't even think about dissecting this slide, but just psychotic experiences, internalizing problems, which means that they are depressed, they think they have problems. Externalizing means they act out. Attention problems, cognition problems, thought problems, social problems, birth weight, all of these are higher in children, average age 9.9, who have been exposed to marijuana in the uterus. So protecting children from marijuana involves parents. There's also a lot of marijuana-related hospitalizations after legalization. I won't get into this because I think Kevin Sabat, my colleague, is probably going to discuss it. We hear about marijuana being the solution for the opioid crisis. All you need to do is give people marijuana and the opioid crisis will disappear. But a young man living in the Boston area named Adway Whitaker showed that the highest risk for developing an opioid use disorder is marijuana use before the age of 18. The risk is much greater. So let's summarize where we are. The brain is maturing until the mid-20s, and THC is unsafe for the fetus. It's not safe for the adolescent, the young adult, and even for the adult, especially potent marijuana. Casual use, rare use is not a problem compared to how more people are using now. And in the US, we have more young adolescents using daily than ever before. High-potency marijuana poses a much greater risk. There's no evidence that you need high potency for anything except the evidence that it's going to bring you more profits, more users, and more daily use, and more consequences. It's associated with a number of adverse consequences, including addiction, psychosis, hospitalization, and parents can have an enormous influence, not only on fetal development, but in terms of influencing a child's use. So we have to challenge the current dogmas on marijuana. This is the 10th city in San Francisco taken by Michael Schellenberger, who's written a wonderful, he's a physician, he's written a wonderful essay on what he sees, the complete disastrous effect of the current status of trying to legalize and normalize use in San Francisco and what's happened to the population there. I urge you to get hold of his essay. So in conclusion, drug policy, we have to remember this is what is being said. It's a failed war on drugs. People have always used, but if you excavate what are the goals of drug policy, why do you call it failure? Have people always used? All of these conventional talking points can be questioned and dissected and actually in many ways destroyed. Supply reduction, which has a powerful, powerful role to play. They say treat, don't pursue supply. That is wrong, and I can show you plenty of data to prove that that is wrong. The social standards, drug standards are obsolete and uncool. That only depends on what your goals are. Abstinence is not necessary in treatment. That's the new. You meet people where they want. If they want to continue using drugs, that's fine, as long as no harm comes to them. But that, again, doesn't have good evidence behind it. Destigmatize use of prescription or illicit drugs. Guess what will happen if we destigmatize all use? And the role of parents, don't let parents stigmatize drug use. What else do parents, what other equipment will parents have if they don't stigmatize drug use? So, in essence, I think the medicalization movement of marijuana is our Trojan horse to legalization. The same is true for hallucinogens. The same is true for many other drugs that are going to happen. And I think it's already happened with opioids. That's why we have such a problem that we do. What can you do to promote prevention? What can you do? Prevent multi-generational drug use. The questions that you can ask architects of liberal drug policies are very simple. Number one, what motivates some to abandon vulnerable people to continue using addictive, deadly drugs? Number two, how can you moralize superior treatment of poor minorities, but you enable the conditions for their death? What human good has come from addiction to drugs? How will liberal drug policies prevent recruitment of our children? Regulations haven't worked. Why is mitigation but not prevention a primary goal? Define the war on drugs and claims of failure. Do use and consequences increase with legal supply? What are the policies for hundreds to thousands of new psychoactive substances? Will they be legal? What about this human experiment without informed consent? Why increase the suffering and financial burden of individuals? So we're at a crossroads now. Is it public health or profit? All of us as citizens decide. And remember what I always say, that we are not waging this war on drugs because we enjoy a war on drugs. We are waging this war because the brain is the repository of our humanity. And we are dedicated to defend our brains. Thank you.